Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the Thursday, October 13th, 2022, regular meeting of the Financial Advisory Commission. We have with us thus far myself, Fred Sussman, Chair, Bob Burden, Vice Chair, Ed Meehan, Jim Cardillo, and Frank Brown. Still waiting for Commission members Perry Hepworth and Patrick Bannon. Also with us are Alderman Ross Arnett and Alderwoman Ellie Tierney, City Manager Mike Malinoff, Finance Director Jody Dickinson, and Madeline Horo from City of Annapolis TV, and David Jarrell, Public Works Director. Sorry, David. So that having been said, I see Mike Wiles, City Attorney, has just joined us. Welcome, Mike. I've sent out an agenda. Have you all had an opportunity to read and digest the agenda?
Yes.
Assuming you have, any revisions or correction to the agenda? Hearing none, entertain a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Motion made by Bob Burden, seconded by, don't all speak up at once, Ed Meehan.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye or raising your right hand.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously. Thank you very much. We have 4 sets of minutes to approve. Thank to Kim Moronsky for preparing them. They're June 9th, June 16th, June 23rd, and August 11th. They were all submitted to you previously. Are there any revisions or corrections to the agenda? I'm sorry, to any of these minutes. I'll take them jointly first. Hearing none, entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the commission meetings on June 9th, 16th, and 23rd, and August 14th.
This is Frank Brown. I so move.
Moved by Frank Brown, seconded by Bob Burden. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye or raising your right hand.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Let's move now to Finance Department. And I have 2 items there on the agenda. One is upcoming bond sale, and I sent out yesterday after I received from Jody and her staff the proposed bond ordinance, and Jody's going to give us a presentation on that. And then Hillman Garage public-private partnership status, and I'm not sure whether it's going to be Jody or Dave Jarrell or Mike Malinoff or who from staff are going to present on that. So let's start with the first, any general Finance Department matters, Jody, that are not on the agenda?
No, nothing that's not on the agenda. The most important thing we need to talk to you about today is the bond sale, and it kind of goes, those 3 items you named are kind of all interrelated. So,
okay, let me turn it over to you then, Jody. Let's talk about the bond sale first and the proposed bond ordinance that I sent out yesterday. I apologize to commission members for the late hour of getting them to you. I was turn them over to you as soon as I received them from staff. As I understand it, Jody, this bond authorization ordinance would authorize the sale or refunding of up to, I think, $26 million in bonds for 3 projects. The resiliency project is City Dock, the Curtis Beach project, and then all refunding bonds from the Hillman Garage project. Is that essentially correct?
yeah, essentially, as you know, we were working on the concession agreement and the bond sale related to the Hillman Garage and City Dock construction. And that was recently finished, and the bonds sold in the beginning of September. And as a part of that deal, we have an option to refinance the sub debt in that deal. There were two pieces of debt in that deal. The senior debt was sold to outside buyers, and there were a few of them organizations that bought those bonds. And then the sub debt was loaned to the project by a private partner, and that sub debt is very expensive debt. It's got an interest rate, a total interest cost over time of about 9.25%. And so we want to refinance that sub debt, and we went back and forth with the private partner while we were working on the concession agreement. It's one of the reasons why it took a while. And all along we were trying to get the interest rate down. And at the end, they told us that they were going to give us this one-time option in during construction, or within 60 days after substantial completion of the project, we could refinance the sub debt. And so
Jody, if you would, for all of us novices, or not as astute in this stuff as you are, can you explain, what you mean by sub debt?
Okay, so in this deal, in the deal to finance the construction of Hillman and provide a $25 million concession payment towards the City Dock project, we worked with a private partner and Medco to find the funding for that. And in that process, Medco issued bonds for us for the project. And they also issued so in that process, they issued two pieces of debt. They sold bonds to the market, out in the market, through Morgan Stanley. And they sold the bonds, but it wasn't enough senior debt to cover the whole $25 million concession payment. So the private partner lent their own funds to the deal in a second piece of debt called sub debt. And it's sub, of course, stands for subordinate, meaning it has a secondary claim on the revenue flow. The senior debt that's being held by various firms is backed up, is the senior debt, and it has claims on all of the revenues coming from the new parking garage and coming from the downtown parking area that's also committed to the deal. And the revenues from those areas, the garage and the parking spaces, is being funneled into the concessionaire, Medco, through a trust. And Medco is then responsible for paying the senior debt, paying the debt service on the senior debt. Then they are paying the operational cost of the garage and the operational cost of the parking enforcement activities in those parking spaces, and then paying the debt service on the sub debt. And then the net amount left over from that comes to the city in the form of what we call a waterfall payment. We're at the bottom of the waterfall. We'll get whatever revenues come off that revenue stream. And then we can use that in the parking fund for whatever purposes we want to. And
Bob has a question.
Mhm.
Bob,
Jody, what was the issue where we couldn't fund the entire project through senior debt?
because the revenue flow, and this is something we knew from the beginning, the revenue flow from the new garage and the surrounding parking district was not adequate enough to have a senior debt series to cover the whole project and carry a minimum investment grade bond rating. And Moody's would only give it a triple B. I think it's triple B, triple B3 or something like that, as a minimum investment grade rating for the bonds. And the only way we could get that is they maximize the amount of proceeds we could get under that senior debt based on getting that rating. If we would have tried to do the whole deal, the bonds would not be rated.
Now we're paying 9.2% on the subordinate debt. What is the interest rate we're paying on the senior debt?
That was a little over 5, if I remember, just north of 5. And so, it's a better rating. It's got first claim on all the revenue flow. The sub debt's more expensive. It's just above us in the waterfall of revenues coming off those revenue sources.
Now, when you
But
look
the-
at
but the-
this, I'm
But the
sorry.
city's not paying it. The deal is paying it.
The garage
The garage.
patrons and the patrons that use the parking spaces around the downtown area are paying for the debt.
And Medco is facilitating the payment of the debt.
They issued those bonds. They were able to give it the Series A carries a tax exempt rate, a tax exempt category. The sub debt was a taxable series.
Okay.
Now, when I say 9.25%, that's not the coupon rate that you'll see on the bonds. But if you measure the investment returns over the 30 years on the sub debt, the total all-in interest cost is an annual rate of 9.25%. And there are various things that are affecting that, including the fact that the sub debt increases based on inflation. They have an inflation adjustment, which is protecting the debt series, protecting them against inflation.
Okay,
Which
are
is
you
one
saying-
reason why it gets more expensive. We have to actually borrow it. What it does is add to our debt over time.
Okay, so we have a variable interest rate of 9.25%. Is that what you're,
No, the coupon, I believe the coupon rates are 7.25%. I'd have to look at the long-term projection in their model. But there was a stated interest rate, coupon rate on the bonds, and I believe it was 7.25%.
so where does the inflation factor come in then again?
So every twice a year, they measure inflation. And if inflation increases, we have to inflate the amount of debt we've borrowed. And so we're paying, and we at least pay 2% inflation over time. We have a floor of 2%
Mhm.
and a ceiling of 5%. Is what we worked into the deal, because we wanted a cap, but they said, well, if you have a cap, then we're gonna have to have a floor. So that'll be adjusted, and over time, what it does is it increases the principal in the debt, but we're paying it down as well. So it gets paid down over 30 years, but because we borrow more, it's got that impact on the rate.
Now, with this entire financial arrangement that we have with Medco, the subordinate debt with the private partner and so forth, they're pretty much taking on the responsibilities for servicing the debt. In this agreement that has been put together, what is the exposure of the city in terms of, the debt, in terms of responsibility or anything of that nature?
So the debt as it currently exists is not the city's debt. It is Medco's debt.
Okay.
I will say that, so all in all, if the revenues of the garage and the downtown parking area were so badly impacted that it couldn't pay the principal on the debt, we would not be responsible for paying it. But they have built in a lot of debt service reserves that would be higher than what we normally would see in a bond deal. And that's one of the things that happened near the end of our negotiations is Moody's said, we need more reserves. And they increase the amount of debt service reserve, and then they asked for another escrow reserve for the senior bonds. And the sub-debt partner, there's terms such as, and David, you might need to help me with this, at the end of the 30 years, if certain circumstances exist, they can stretch the debt out another few years. I can't remember what it is. It's we tried to put a cap on that, but there's certain provisions like that allow the private partner to have an additional claim on revenues, and as well during the term of the senior debt, there's an extra provision to not remit revenue flow to the city if the revenues aren't providing enough debt service coverage. So I say it's not our debt, but there have been built-in protections all along. Most of those protections are for the senior debt. And that just came from the market demands when we were going to sale. They said, in order to be able to get this rating, we need to do A, B, C, D. It made us come up with more revenue for that and lower the amount of senior debt proceeds we could have for the project. Most of the protections for the sub-debt lender, the private partner, is in the inflation factor.
So Bob, I think it's really important to note that when the parking revenue projection was put together, that was put together by a firm called Walker Consulting. They're sort of the foremost parking consulting firm in the US, and they're very conservative in their revenue projections. When we got to Moody's to try and establish the bond rating for this deal, we found, much to our chagrin, that they're very bearish on parking over the next 30 years. So they're even more conservative for the bondholders and for the bond rating than what Walker was. So they asked Walker to redo much of their revenue study, and that was part of what took so long too. It was a real effort to work with Moody's. They really drove the deal the last few months in order to get the investment grade rating that we felt like we needed for the senior bonds. So there were a lot of changes that had to be made. The debt service reserve had to be increased. The revenue projections had to be decreased in order to meet their desires for given that bond rating. So we feel like we have a very conservative deal as far as making the revenues that have been projected. We think we're going to exceed those. The city, because we get whatever comes out of the waterfall, any loss of revenue affects us the most because all the other payees are going to get paid first. And we're counting on that revenue to help support transit, as we've talked about all along, that we need to still support transit. So the projection is about $1 million a year that we'll get from the waterfall to support transit. But if revenues decrease below the level that's projected, which again is very conservative, then the city will, that $1 million payment will shrink.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Fred.
Go ahead, Jody. She's still there? Go on.
So Fred, since the update of Hillman Garage directly ties into what we're talking about here, maybe I could give that. Now,
I was just gonna.
We actually put together a presentation, and Jody has the last couple of slides to talk really in detail of this topic, but I can give an update.
She's also hopping back on right now.
Okay. All right. Well, then she can finish.
Yeah, let me know when you want the presentation.
I'm so sorry, everybody. I was going to look for the document, the OS, to see if I could get the investment grade rating, and then I hit the wrong button and I shut the whole thing off. That was bad. I had to.
Okay, continue on, Jody. We're finished with Bob's question for the time being.
Yeah, So I don't know, David was just ending that sentence with that I could talk about something in particular. I don't know if you you wanted me to address anything that he was addressing because I missed the last like 2 minutes of conversation. So what we're doing, we finished that process. The bonds were sold. The sub debt's very expensive. We'd like to take advantage of that one-time option to refinance that sub debt. If we don't do it now, there's an option at 10 years, but the 10-year option comes with a penalty, which virtually wipes out a lot of the savings we would get if we had good interest rates at those times and could move them to general obligation bonds. So this ties into the bond ordinance because what it's doing is asking for permission to issue additional debt. If you remember, at your August meeting that you had, you approved the bond ordinance for our regular bonds that we sell every year. We're going to issue general obligation bonds. That bond issue is planned for settlement in December, in early part of December. So what we're proposing to do, and it may be time to go, we have a presentation. We want to refinance. The bond ordinance requests more than enough additional bond authority to repay the sub debt with a combination of with general obligation bonds is what we'll be doing. We'll be issuing additional general obligation bonds, but there's a little bit of a twist to it, and I'll explain that when we go through the slides. Also in that request for debt, we are processing a request to add to the capital budget $500,000 for Cars Beach in order to help. It's not enough to buy the property. There's an adjacent property to the Cars Beach purchase that would hopefully, if we were able to purchase it, serve as a location for a visitor center or something like that. As it is now, we can't construct any structures on the purchase of Cars Beach because the POS money from the state has limits and you are not allowed to develop the land we purchased. So they're not going to allow structures on that property. So one of the plans is to purchase a structure, residence that's right next door and turn that into some kind of visitor center location so that we don't just have the Cars Beach property, we have visitor center with the history and that type of thing. So I don't know if either David or Mike want to give you any more details on that. The 500,000 will not buy the property, but it's going to serve as our contribution in seed money towards fundraising efforts with private donors to get the rest of the money necessary to buy that piece of property.
I can elaborate a little bit. One of the dilemmas about being at home is letting my dog in and out. So I had to hop off at the beginning to let her in. What Jody said summarized it well. The $2 million of federal grant monies that we received, as she mentioned, is restricted on the cars purchase. We can't do any structures. I think it's limited, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but just to maybe signage and a trail, but no capital facilities.
Yeah, it's for development is what they say, but we're not allowed to put facilities because of POS restrictions.
Exactly. That's right. It's the POS restrictions. So as Jody mentioned, the mayor and the Blacks of the Chesapeake and the Chesapeake Conservancy, Joel Dunn, are working on assembling a group of donors, private, otherwise, and the $500,000 is considered seed money towards that purchase so that the federal monies can be used to build a visitor center and house other interpretive information at the Dwelling on Moors property.
Bob, I have a question, and then I'll go to you. Jody, what is the impact, if any, if the ordinance is approved and if the bonds are sold on the debt limit, the bond?
Right. So as you know, I spoke to the fact that the sub debt is being paid for by the parking revenues. And the city gets what's left from the revenue flow. If we repay the sub debt, pay it off, we'll get more funding coming off the waterfall for the city. That amount won't be used for sub debt payments. It'll come to the city, and we will use that same revenue flow from the parking fund to pay for the additional bonds. So these bonds will be repaid through the parking fund and not through the general fund. So as we measure debt service as a percent of our general fund expenses, as we do, it's not going to impact that bar chart we do every year looking at debt affordability. However, when the rating agencies are looking at your debt, they're going to consider this debt a little bit differently than they would utility debt per se, that's being paid off by utility rates. Parking and transportation are kind of associated with the general fund. They'll consider that when looking at our rating. Our financial advisors don't believe it's going to have any impact on how they rate our bonds because of the revenue flow coming off the parking deal is enough to fund the sub debt. It's going to be enough, is projected to be enough to cover this extra debt that we'd be taking on. So they don't think it's going to have a big impact on the rating. You know, we'll see. We're meeting with the rating agencies in early November to go over our plans. I will say that the $500,000 for Cars Beach is a general fund, will be general fund bonds. That will add to the debt that's being repaid by the general fund. That should have very little impact, as you know, because 500,000 is small in comparison to the total debt load that we carry in the general fund.
Jody, are there any, will there be any conditions upon the expenditure of that 500,000 for Cars Beach? Are there any preconditions before that can be spent?
Well, we have to have all the money in hand before we try to buy the property. So if the private partners don't come up with enough purchasing power to do it all, then that won't go anywhere.
Mike, you had your hand up?
Yes, Fred. Right now, there's a appraisal, I think, being prepared by the Chesapeake Conservancy to go to value the property. And as Jody mentioned, the money will be spent towards the purchase, but we don't quite have an idea what the cost will be. I think I was told by Joel, the property is currently assessed at about $1 million, but I think it'll appraise out at a little bit more than $2 million. So unless the rest of the money is assembled, then I think the money's restricted just to the purchase.
Thank you, Mike. Bob, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, actually, Fred, the question you asked was the question I was going to ask, but Jody's answer did, bring another question to mind. Okay, this 26 million bond ordinance, 26, 27 million is going to be GO debt. And so that I understand correctly, I perhaps need some clarification. If my understanding is correctly, GO debt, as defined in how we determine our debt affordability limits for the city, is normally counted into determining those debt affordability limits. However, what you're indicating is that GO debt internally is going to, for lack of a better term, be managed like it was a revenue bond rather than a GO bond in terms of payment. Revenues are going to come from parking and so forth, or the garage, etc. However, if that money does not materialize, then that GO debt has to be, that debt service has to be paid through other means. So,
yes.
And not only that, the rating agencies may view the GO debt as we define GO debt in our debt affordability limit here in the city, which could create some challenges, potential challenges down the line. So given that, I think I go back to Fred's question. In a worst case scenario, if this bond ordinance of 26 million or so for GO debt, in a worst case scenario, had to be identified as GO debt and within the definition of how we handle GO debt as pertained to our debt affordability limit, where would that put the city relative to the 12% cap that we have, placed on our debt affordability?
Okay, so I'll go back and talk about the terminology a little bit. Every bond that we have outstanding right now, whether it's being paid by the general fund or the utility funds or the parking fund or the transportation fund, is called GO debt. If for some reason any of that debt would fail, general obligation pledge means the city will take whatever action it needs to repay the debt service, including taxing the citizens to repay it. So the term GO debt is applied to all of our bonds. We did have a revenue bond that we had on the utility side for a few years. They're very hard to manage. We refinanced that in the last couple of years with GO debt. So what I was saying with when we analyze the 10%, we're looking at the debt that's the GO debt that's being repaid by general fund sources. And that 10% limit applies to that debt. What I was saying about the treatment of the GO debt that's funded by a set revenue flow, which is, I think you were calling it a revenue bond, but what it is utility, water and sewer debts being paid by water and sewer fees. Transportation debt, there's not very much of that. That's paid by transportation revenue sources. Some of those are from the parking fund there, but there's very little there. We have a stormwater management fund, it's called a watershed restoration fund. That is the debt there is being paid by the watershed restoration fee. So those are fee-based debt. As David explained, parking revenue, although it's GO debt and is being paid by parking fees, is not included in our debt service, but the rating agencies will look at that a little more heavily than they will utility debt, because utility fees are more of a certainty than parking fees. Parking fees are generated by market forces and people wanting to come to Annapolis and so it's something that may not always be what's projected because we can't tell what's going to happen in the economy. Utility fees are more of a certainty because everybody needs water and sewer services. So the GO debt that's not paid by the general fund, I would see it in two categories: fee-based, critical fee-based, certain fee-based, and then these parking revenues that, based on the projections, they're good. But if something were to happen, the debt that's funded by those would have to be covered by the general fund. And if you took all of the GO debt that we have out there and said we had to pay it by the general fund, we'd be way above our 12%. But that's just not a likelihood at all because of the fees that cover all that debt.
Well, and thank you for the explanation. I realize that, the fee debt is certainly more determinative. The parking debt is the variable. The parking revenue is variable. Okay, so in that case, what debt do we count towards the debt affordability limit then? And does this particular bond, become part of that formula for determining our debt affordability?
No,
or does it not? And if it does not, given the variability of the revenue stream and the potential of how the rating agencies may view that, if we did have to include that into the formula for debt affordability, where would that put us?
So I don't have the answer. We haven't calculated that bar chart to see where that would end up. I would think it would be significant. That's just my guess. I think I don't know, I have to see how the 26 million, and just so you know, 26 million is not likely to be issued. We believe it's gonna be 2 or 3 million less than that. But Davenport, our financial advisors, wanted to make sure, based on whatever's going on at the market at the time we sell these bonds, that they have more than enough authority to move forward with it and not have to come back to council for additional authority. Because then every moment, as you know, with this inflated subdebt, every moment is important. So we're trying to, and the market, as you know, is tumultuous. So we got it. We want to move on it. And we want to make sure we have enough. So the issue of debt is probably going to be closer to 23 million, you know, thereabouts. So maybe a little bit less. But so I would analyze it in comparison to that. And if you look at the outstanding debt that we have tied to the general fund, I think it's somewhere in the 50s or 60s. So that's increasing it by, I don't know, 20% or something like that. I'd have to do that analysis. So that in my head, I think it could push that bar up over 12, but it would depend on how we handle the debt service payout and what the interest rates are at the time.
How close are we to the 12% cap right now?
We're not anywhere. We're under 10. See 10, yeah. No, we're under 11. We're over 10, but not very far over 10. We've kept it very low. Every year when we show you those projections, we're very conservative in the way we calculate that. And it's not projected to go up over 11 for a couple years. It's always a couple years out that it's projected to slip up over 11, but we've been keeping it under 11, between 10 and 11 every year.
Okay, thank you, Jody.
Okay, anything else, Jody, before I think David has a presentation?
Yeah, so it kind of all ties in together, which is why I wanted to talk about the deal, the concession deal, this bond ordinance that we're coming to you for permission, and then our bond sale will happen all at the same time. And we'll talk about that at the end of this presentation about how we're planning to do these bond issues at the same time as a regular issue, so that we can combine the bond issues and save on bond issuance costs and not have to do a separate bond issue for this sub-debt refinance. So we can, if you're ready, we can start going through the presentation. And these are some slides, and David will explain the purpose of the presentation and what we did it for, and then and we'll lead you through it.
Great, thank you. Before I turn to David, anybody have any questions? No? David?
Okay, Madeline, if you can put up the presentation. So we met with the council over the last couple of weeks in advance of the introduction of the bond ordinance. Go ahead and move to the second slide, Madeline. To brief them on where we are on the City Dock project, but also on what Jody just talked about. So Jody has the last part of this presentation. But the first part is just an update on the project. So I think, as you know, the P3 is moving forward. We got the funding for the garage, and the garage is moving along, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So the P3 provides funding for the garage. It also provides the waterfall payment that Jody mentioned, as well as the concession payment to cover some of the costs for the City Dock project. Next slide, please. So we had the financial close early in September. It was kind of a tumultuous time for the bond market, because just at the end of August, there had been a big withdrawal of funds from the bond market generally. So we were a bit nervous about how our offering was going to be accepted and whether we would have enough interest to sell out all of the bonds. And it turned out that there was a lot of interest, and it was actually oversubscribed. So there was more demand than there were bonds available. And Jody will talk more about, and she talked already about, the senior debt, which is $47+ million, and the subordinate debt is $21 million. As we went through the process, because the interest rates were going up and because of weakness in the bond market, And because of all the things that Moody's required, the subordinate debt inflated pretty considerably. So that's, and it became expensive when it became tied to inflation. So that's really why we want to refinance that part of the deal. Next slide. So this is a projection of funding for the City Dock project. We're into design for City Dock. So this was always intended to be phased so that we would design the garage and build the garage. And during the building of the garage, we would do the design for City Dock. So we're building the garage now and we're designing City Dock. And we'll talk about some of the design concepts in just a minute. But the total project cost is estimated at $40 million for City Dock. The $25 million is shown at the bottom, the concession payment that we got from AMRP as part of the whole concession deal. We got $10 million this last fiscal year for this fiscal year from the governor and from the legislature as part of the capital budget for this project. We're optimistic that there may be additional money from the state of Maryland in the future. This 10 million was based on how much that we expected to spend within the time limits for the capital budget for this year. And we can go back to talk about because this is a multi-year expenditure for future expenditures. So we're optimistic there's additional money coming from the state. We were granted $3.2 million for the design of the project from Economic Development Agency, a federal agency. So we're working with them to finalize that grant. The grant was approved. We're just doing all the documentation now. We got $1.125 million from Senators Van Hollen and Cardin as earmarks, because the earmarks are back in the federal budgeting process. And so that was from those two senators. We also have grant applications into both FEMA and DOD for additional funding for the resiliency part of these projects. Since this is right next to the Naval Academy, we think that there's funding available through a program that DOD has to assist neighboring communities with resilience issues. And of course, FEMA is really focused on and is getting a lot more funding for resiliency issues. So we're optimistic that there is additional funding coming, but this is the funding that we have as of today. So next slide. So as I mentioned, the Hillman Garage is moving along. It's on schedule. The completion timeframe is next June. We don't want to go through a second summer without Hillman Garage for the downtown area. This is a bit dated. This is as of the end of September, but they've already done the first concrete pour for the second floor. So they're going vertical, as we say. They've got all the slab on the first floor completed. They have done 2 concrete pours so far this week and doing another one tomorrow. So they're working generally 12-hour days to take advantage of the good weather, and we're doing a little dance hoping for a mild winter to allow them to continue to make progress. Next slide. So we put a pretty active mobility plan in place. We relocated all of the monthly parkers in Hillman Garage, and that has worked out. And they seem to be satisfied with parking in God's or Knighton. The city employees have moved out to Park Place. And that seems to be working well. We've getting a lot more employees that are walking to work from Park Place. It's about a 1 mile walk, and so it's good exercise for them. And so generally the mobility plan has worked well. We've had a few struggles with the new parking plan because we put Park Mobile out in the residential areas for the first time, and so that's been sort of a learning process. We also had our new parking manager, premium parking. They'll be the manager both for Hillman Garage and for the what we call the City Dock parking area, the downtown area. They're managing that, and they just took over enforcement responsibilities on September 26th. So that's been a learning process as well. And Ellie has more gray hairs than she did before September 26th because of some of those, because she's taken the brunt of those complaints, but we're working through that as well. So next slide. So you may have noticed our new circulator bus, the shuttle. It's been very, very, very successful. We rebranded it. We've added additional bus to the service during peak hours. As you can see, we color coded it magenta so people would notice that we're getting a lot of ridership of that, of people parking in the various garages and then riding downtown, and really haven't had a lot of issues or complaints with it. We've had a lot of very favorable comments on it. So that's been a success story. Next slide. So we have a kind of a multi-pronged approach to, and what I'm moving to is now sort of the concept design and some of the detailed design that we're doing for City Dock, just to give you an idea. So the first thing we have to address is the storm drains, of course, because that's where the water's coming up currently. It hardly ever comes over the top. When we get flooding downtown, it's because the tide's high enough to come up through the storm drains and flood the streets. So that will be addressed by reconfiguring all the storm drains to run to a single wet well with large pumps that will then pump it. As the wet well fills up, we'll pump it into Eagle Alley. But we're also raising the elevations. We're going to have 5-foot elevation generally across the whole area. But we're also putting flood devices for storm surge that's going to protect up to 8 feet. For storm surges. And then we're going to have the terrace park. If you can think of the area between the Harbor Master building and Susan Campbell Park, it's currently parking. That's going to be a large green space park that's going to be up at 8 feet to also help protect that area. So next slide. So that gives you that, you can see the green space that I was talking about and how it's terraced right by that bus there. It's sort of in the middle of the slide. You can see the steps up to that 8-foot elevation. You can see along the edges as well. But generally the elevation, the protection, otherwise before the pop-up barriers I'm going to talk about in a minute is 5 feet. Next slide. So this shows you our strategy for the flood walls and the storm surge. We have different color codings. The sort of pink magenta color is just going to be a solid wall, either concrete or brick. The orange is, and this is just over, just next to Donner Park, along Compromise Street, is going to be a flip-up barrier. And there's reasons why we need to have that flip up instead of the pop-up that is shown in the yellow. The pop-up, you actually don't really know that they're there until they float up with the higher tide. And then over at Donner Park, you can see that we're going to have a glass flood wall, so they'll be able to see through that and across Eagle Alley. So next slide. So this is a depiction of what these are going to look like. So in the top left picture, if you can see that darker wall where that yellow bubble is pointing to, and then there's a white pilaster, and then a turn in that. So that's actually the pop-up barrier. So normally, as I said, you can't see it. It just is at the same level as the sidewalk. It's, unless you know it's there, it's not obvious that it is. You can see what it looks like on the right. So as the tide comes up, it actually floats up with the tide. And then if it's all the way deployed, it looks like on the rendering on the bottom left, that white wall that's deployed that will provide protection up to 8 feet. On the bottom right is an actual picture of an application like that. So that's the pop-up wall that's fully deployed in its up position. Next slide. So this is just a picture or a rendering from that green park area that we envision. If you look just beyond the white concrete area, sort of in the middle of the picture, that's Susan Campbell Park. We're not going to either elevate that or protect that, so that will still, during high tide events, that will still flood. So if it rises above 5 feet, then that area will flood. But all the other areas are going to be protected from flooding. Next slide. I think we move on to Jody's slide here. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Jody.
All right, so as I said, we've been, even before we were done finalizing the concession agreement, I was working with bond counsel and our advisors to come up with options for refinancing the sub-debt, knowing that time was of the essence, and we only had this 1 year period where we would be able to put it together. And so what they are recommending is to, as you can see there, at the time that we estimate we would be paying off the sub-debt, we have to give them 90 days notice. We would be paying off about $21.9 million of debt. And some of that there, if you remember earlier, we talked about $21.4 million being the sub-debt. But this includes accrued interest, and it includes one inflation adjustment that we would incur. And the bond counsel is recommending, in order to have the lowest cost of borrowing, that the concession payment, remember we had about 25 million. That's about half of it comes from the senior bonds and half of it comes from the sub-debt. The senior bonds had enough leftover funding after Hillman costs to put, I think theirs is 12 something or 13 something. This 13.5 is what concession payment that resulted from the sub-debt. And a bond counsel says if we use the 13.5 of the concession payment and some new taxable bonds, which have to be taxable for various reasons, and I can go through that if I need to, that's going to pay off the sub-debt. And then what we would do is issue new tax exempt bonds and put them into the city dock to replace the 13.5 million concession payment that we used. And the reason that they're recommending this is because in order to have to have any opportunity to issue tax exempt bonds, we need to use the funds for construction. So those tax exempt bonds would go into the project for the construction of City Dock. And that is a lower cost debt. Tax exempt bonds carry lower interest rate. So that would mean 13.5 of the payoff could be tax exempt, and the 8.4 would still have to be taxable. The bond counsel believes that we would not be able to issue tax exempt debt to pay off another entity's debt. And because Medco issued the bonds, and the second series was Medco, the sub-debt, Medco issued the sub-debt, and they borrowed that from the partner. That is somebody else's debt. And we cannot issue tax exempt bonds to pay off somebody else's debt, even if it was used for the project. So that is their opinion. And so we'd like to move ahead with this scenario where we use the concession payment that resulted from the sub-debt, pay off the sub-debt, and we'll have to issue some new taxable bonds to pay off the remainder of the sub-debt, and then issue new bonds of 13.5. So we'd be in the same place debt-wise from a principal standpoint. But we'd save a tremendous amount of debt service over 30 years, which you can see here at the bottom, that they project present value savings of 10.8 million at least, and maybe as high as 26.7, depending on the inflation factors that would happen over the 30 years. On the right, we've shown you the advantages and disadvantages to using this. As I mentioned, this is the way to get our savings, present value savings, as high as we can in the scenario where we're issuing general obligation bonds. They can be issued through a competitive sale at the same time that we're doing our other bond sale. And so we don't have to have bond issuance costs for two different bond sales. That would be more expensive. We'll save quite a bit of money with that. And this way we can bring it to market faster than we could if we had Medco refinance the bonds through another method. I mean, we could ask Medco to refinance it with another method, but it'd take much longer to get them to market and would likely not save us as much as what we see here. And the disadvantage, as we talked about earlier, and Bob brought this up, is if the parking revenues were not sufficient, this could put a burden on the city taxpayers. It would be on hook because it's a general obligation bond.
Jody, if I may,
Yeah,
worst case scenario, if we go through with this deal, what can go wrong? And where does that leave us?
so as you know, in this process, there's quite an extensive 30-year projection of parking revenues, which everybody believes is very conservative. So when we project those over time, it appears that the parking revenues are going to be more than sufficient to do this and to have money left over for the city to pay for other parking or transportation costs. However, I think it would, and I'm just kind of thinking here, what kind of event would have to take place that would mean the parking revenues would not be sufficient to pay the general obligation bond issued? And that is some, I don't know what we call them, supervening events. That term was used throughout our negotiation process, something major that would either impact the garage permanently, impact Annapolis permanently. I don't know if David or Mike would want to throw out scenarios. I see Alderwoman Tierney has her hand up. Maybe she wants to talk about these events that could possibly impact us to that extent where the parking revenues would not be sufficient.
I actually just have a question to
Okay.
that effect.
All right. So the answer to your question is it'd have to be something really substantial that would impact the garage revenues so excuse me.
Dramatically.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had another interruption here on my kitchen. So it's substantially impacted so that the garage was not producing most of its revenue. I mean, I'd have to go back and measure what it would take to eat up that waterfall payment completely. Right now, we're projecting that we'll have close to $1 million a year coming off the waterfall. So whatever event might happen, like the garage was, let's say something damaged the garage, so it couldn't be used. I mean, we have seen it's not impossible to have an economic occurrence that would shut down parking for a while. We saw that with the pandemic. It impacted parking revenues pretty severely when we were shut down for the pandemic because people just weren't coming downtown. So those are the types of events, but they would have to be long-term in nature because the debt service reserves are pretty substantial. And there's still $1 million coming off the waterfall that would be excess revenue that could be applied.
Thank you, Jody.
I could start throwing out major scenarios for you, but
No, don't do that.
you
Don't do
understand.
that.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't
You
do
can
that.
understand what I'm talking about. I can't.
Don't do that.
Now,
Fred, we had a lot of experts who deal with parking. So
I
this is,
understand that,
this,
Michael.
yeah, so the experts who deal with parking went through all of the scenarios, and we would not be in the proper position as city staff to be able to say publicly what the most dangerous impacts would be, and I think it would be a disservice to the
I'm not
public.
asking, yeah, Michael, I'm not asking for that. Jody has answered, the question.
Thank you.
It was general term, what I was, kind of thinking. I think Alderwoman Tierney had her hand up first, and Mr. Cardillo.
Oh, thank you for your indulgence. Just because I can't see this on a construction timeline, if you will, and David, maybe you'll be able to help me with this. Meanwhile, we are in probably during all of this time, we're in a design development phase of City Dock. And my question is, will this affect this payment flow, if you will this affect the construction timeline of City Dock? This, I guess the word for it is proof of, payment. It just.
No, the answer is no, it will not. So even if this refinancing doesn't happen and we move forward with the deal as it's struck, everything's going to move forward. So that would be the implication, is that we end up having to, if this isn't approved, we end up paying the higher amount for the subordinate debt. But again, that's all part of the current deal. So that can move forward and it's fully funded.
Right.
So no, it won't affect that. We're continuing with the projects.
And that risk, if you will, is sort of by the AMRP structure, I think. I mean, they're in. They owe it to us to have this construction, run smoothly.
Correct. Yeah, and Wayne Turner has liquidated damages built into the design build contract.
Right, all under AMRP. So yeah, thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Alderwoman. Jim, and then Bob.
Thank you. On the current slide under the cons section, it refers to bonds would need to be repaid if parking revenues are not sufficient. I don't recall the clause in the PPP about with AMRP about the ability of the servicer to raise the parking rates in both the garage and the affected downtown area. Is that subject to approval by the city for an increase in parking rates to sustain the debt service?
So Jody, I can address that.
Thank you, David.
So what we need to do is the city has the ability to raise rates. AMRP, premium parking do not. But what we have to do when we're thinking, if we do think about lowering rates, is we have to achieve that same amount of parking revenue to service the debt. I mean, that sort of goes without saying, but that's built into the agreement that we can't lower rates such that we're going to drop below the revenue levels that are required to service the debt. But only the city can raise the rates. But again, we need to maintain what we plan to do is to, much like we do for water and sewer and stormwater, is to hire a consultant each year to look at the parking rates like we look at the utility rates, to make sure that we have all of the requirements covered. And then we'll adjust the rates accordingly if there's additional revenue that's required, or if there's areas where the rates aren't balanced, because we have the parking garage rates, but we also have the street rates and the surface parking rates. So all of those need to be properly balanced and still achieve the revenue goals that we have.
Okay, you equated it to a utility, and a utility will go to a PSC and request a rate increase. Does AMRP have that provision to go to the city and request a rate increase?
In the modeling, there were rate increases throughout the 30 years, but what David's saying is we have clearance on all of those decisions.
Okay.
It comes to the city for approval.
Okay.
So that's the extent of that, but we have to make sure that there's coverage for all the debt and the operations, and that we can cover the revenue flow that was anticipated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Bob?
Yes, I have two questions, Jody, just so that I understand the refinancing of the P3 debt, sub-debt. 13.5 will come from the concession payment. Then the city's gonna, and then the city will issue new taxable bonds of about 8.3 to cover the 21.8. And then the city will go back to the bond market, and the city will go ahead and put out an issuance for new tax exempt bonds
Okay.
in the amount of 13.5.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think I need to, I need to clarify that all of these, the new taxable bonds and the new tax exempt bonds that you see here will be a part of our upcoming bond sale in December. Meaning we're going to do our regular bonds, the tax exempt bonds for City Dock, and the taxable bonds to pay off the rest of the sub debt. We're going to do all of that in December.
Okay, so
In
the
one
city
bond sale.
so the city will be, to pay off this sub debt, the city will be issuing between new taxable bonds and tax exempt bonds, a total of 21.8 million in bond issuances, right?
Yes, and remember that we asked for 26. There's 500,000 in there for the Cars Beach. There's going to be bond issuance costs that we have to finance through this, through the bond sale. And then, so that's going to be probably closer to 22, 23 million. But like I said, they don't know what the market's going to look like. And if we had to sell any of the bonds at a discount, we may need to issue more principal in order to have better interest rates. Long-term. So it just depends on what the bond buyers are looking for at that time. So that's why they wanted the higher number in the bond ordinance.
Now, the second question I have probably goes back to some earlier questions in previous meetings, but for us to be able to move this PPP effort forward and cover the money needed, the 40 million for the city dock, we're basically are committing garage and parking revenues to this effort. That those dollars were going towards something else within the city budget before they were
No.
recommitted.
So what else? No, the money that would have gone to pay the sub debt, because the parking revenues are going to pay the sub debt service, are now going to pay this debt service.
I don't think that's my question. My question is, before we even got into the PPP effort
Okay, all
and
right.
so forth, the parking garages and parking itself was generating revenue for the city, right? And that revenue was going to support something within the budget. Now that money is being rediverted to service the debt of one form or another. Is that correct? Okay.
Correct, but not
So-
all of it's being diverted. We have revenues from other parking garages, and we have other monies from other parking areas that are outside the downtown parking areas. So there's enough parking revenue that are not a part of this deal that will still fund those other expenses in the parking fund.
But still, there's going to be a delta there that needs to be made up, correct?
No, because we don't have Hillman Garage anymore. The operational cost of Hillman Garage are coming out of this deal. So
Okay.
we've lost the revenue from those sources, but we've also lost the expenses for those sources are also running through this deal.
Okay,
So
so it's a
then-
break-even arrangement then, right?
I hope so, at least.
Okay.
You know, we'll see what happens to the other garages once this new garage goes up. If they're, you know, what their patronage is at those garages, what happens with the parking spaces. I know we're expanding how many of the residential areas have paid parking so that we can try to keep people out of the residential areas as well. So it may be that we end up with more revenue net after we do this. And the enforcement efforts are going to be stronger.
Bob, if I could just add though, that if we do this refinancing, it moves us much closer to that balance deal than if we have to pay that high cost of the sub debt. the waterfall is going to be larger, and that allows us to balance it out.
Mhm.
Okay, Fred, just one comment that I wanted to share. Going back to your original question about worst case scenario. And I do appreciate the city attorney's observations that he made concerning the restrictive nature of any additional information that could be shared. But nonetheless, the administration is coming to us looking for our advisory opinion. The administration has the full benefit of all the information, pros and cons concerning this undertaking. However, the Financial Advisory Commission is only being given a portion of that information because the city attorney has advised the administration that there's certain parts that cannot be shared outside the immediate circle of the administration. That kind of puts us in a somewhat disadvantageous position in rendering our advisory opinion. I just want to make note of that, that we would be making an advisory opinion without the full benefit of all the information that the administration has available and wanting to move this project forward. And so I think that your question was very appropriate. I support the full answer that would come from that question, but recognize that, that the city attorney has advised the administration that there's certain information that cannot be shared with the Financial Advisory Commission.
Yeah.
Chair,
if I could-
Mr. Chair, let me
Okay.
correct
Yeah,
what I was
That's
saying.
what he said.
I was not saying that the Financial Advisory Commission could not have all the information that the staff has. What I was trying to get advised was not to speculate and give an answer that has no real basis.
Right.
When we have documents and expert reports that give the proper information, the proper answer. And putting Jody in a position where she had to speculate about the worst possible scenario is unfair and untimely, given that we have information from experts that do parking studies all the time, who created the bond rating, the waterfall flow, based on their expertise. And I was just saying it'd be better to refer to that, better than to have us to speculate about the worst possible scenario, because anything could happen at any time to anything. But who are we to speculate about that, given that we do have these studies that show what should come out of the parking revenue and how it would assist the city government in meeting its needs. That's all I was suggesting. But the Financial Advisory Commission, as far as I know, can have whatever information staff wants to provide to it, and without restriction, given that the deal is now done.
Okay, and so therefore, we can assume as a commission that the administration has given us all the necessary information for us to render a quality advisory opinion then.
You asked for the information, they're within their authority to give it to you. I don't know what you've asked for and what they've given, but they're well within their authority to give you everything that they, deem appropriate for your understanding.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
If I could interject for a second, Bob, as opposed to asking Jody to speculate, what was the worst case scenario that the study presented?
So I don't know that in the study there were, here's a scenario, this is what would happen. What I was being asked to do is to say what kind of event might happen that would make the bonds fall to the taxpayers, and I could start making up all kinds of scenarios in my head, but I'm not going to put them out there because I really don't know what would impact it to that extent. I know that the city manager has reminded me that Moody did a report on the rating and their reason for their ratings. Mike, I don't know if you've got that with you to talk about what they were saying about those kind of events. And there's also the OS that went out with the bonds that also discussed the deal and the risk of the parking revenues. I don't remember what kind of detail, but I'm sure they would have mentioned the supervening events issue, where if something happened that was major, what action would be taken as far as servicing the debt.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Jody, anything else from you on this issue, or David?
No, only that, we talked about the bond sales coming up. That's all going to be, we'd like to do it in one issue with all the other bonds together. In a couple, we'll have to do a taxable series and a non-taxable series in that bond issue, but we're used to doing that. And so the ordinance that we're asking you to provide your opinion on, it relates to this extra authority that we're asking for to do this. So.
Okay. Any other questions, comments from commission members?
Fred, a question?
Yes, Jim.
What would be the pros and cons of doing it as two separate issuances? One for the GO bonds and one for the special purpose.
Are you, so I'm not sure which two you're breaking down. If I do two bond issues, I have to pay bond issuance cost twice. So with every bond issue, I have to pay my financial advisor, my bond counsel, we have to pay an underwriter, and we have to go back to the rating agencies to talk to them about the rating on each issue. And all of those incur costs. And typically those are, you borrow a little extra money to pay those costs and then pay the debt service over time. If we do two, I won't say that the amounts would double, but you definitely have a substantial increase in bond issuance costs. if you do it for
Okay.
different issues. So, and also the time it takes us to do a bond issue and all the work that me and my staff have to put into this is substantial.
Speaking for me, and I don't know if I'm speaking for any other commission members, it's just given the fact that this ordinance was 19 pages. I haven't reviewed the full ordinance yet. And because of the uniqueness of this type of financing, I'm looking for a way forward.
A lot of the language that's in there, a lot of the critical language that pertains to this particular issue is in the first few pages. A lot of the language that's in that bond ordinance is the legal, what the bonds have to look like, what they have to include, a lot of legalese on it. So it compares a lot to the earlier bond ordinance. If you were to lay them side to side, a lot of that legal language is the same, but you feel free to read it all. I mean, it gets pretty dull after a while, but a lot of the information is in the first couple sections where they talk about recitals and information about what we're doing.
Jody, what is the timing on this? Do we have to do something today?
You don't. What I will say is that the council will be voting on this, hopefully the first meeting in November. If I go to my calendar, that will be not the 5th, but the 12th. Is that a holiday? That's not a holiday, is it? No, hold on. I got the wrong month. Not the 7th, but the 14th. Be on November 14th. So your meeting, I don't know when it's scheduled. If you could
schedule for November 10th.
All right, so you'd be able to have one more meeting before, and I hope I got that right, correct? The next council, that meeting is on the 14th, okay. That's about as late as it can get and be on the second Monday, but the
It's on the
14th is the
14th.
date of the council, so that's when we'll be doing it. We will have already gone to the rating agencies the week before and worked with them. And the bonds are, like I said, I think it's the early part of December that we have marked for the sale of the bonds. So we have to get it all done before the council votes. They would want to hear what you had to say.
Okay, let me talk to commission members. I am okay at this point, but if there are any commission members who don't feel you have enough information or want time to digest it and want to push it off to our November 10th meeting, then we can certainly do that. So to me, I think it was an excellent presentation, Jody and David. Thank you very, very much for the thoroughness of it. I personally don't see a downside. I'm not going to sit here and speculate what are worst possible scenarios that might happen over the next 30 years. to cause a significant and material reduction in parking revenues that would cause a trigger of the full faith and credit and GO obligations of the taxpayers. And I'm not going to sit here and second guess whether the PPP deal is good, bad, or otherwise. So I am prepared to move forward with this, but if other commission members are not and want to hold it to the 10th, I'll certainly abide by that request. So let me put it up to commission members. Bob?
Fred, I share your perspective on this. I'm pretty much satisfied, and I would be ready to go ahead and move forward today on this. And just a couple comments. First of all, I thought the presentation on the city dock was very well done. There's a lot of work that's gone into it, and quite frankly, I think what's projected to be done and to be able to do it for $40 million, I think is an accomplishment on the city's part. I recognize the complexity of the financial instruments that have to be in place to make all this happen. There are certainly elements of risk. I think those risks as presented are acceptable, to the city. You can't eliminate all the risks, but nonetheless, I think that this whole thing has been very well thought through, and I share your appreciation for the work that the administration has done in getting us to where we are now. So I'm prepared to go ahead and move forward on this today if the other commission members are prepared to move forward on it.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Ed, is your hand raised? I see a white hand. Usually it's a yellow hand.
Oh, no, I'm good to go. No questions.
Okay. Are there any commission members who are not prepared to move forward today? No, well, that's great. I'd rather get it done today since we spent so much time on it than push it off a month. So at this point, I'll entertain a motion from the commission to advise the city council that the commission is in support of the proposed bond ordinance.
So move.
Motion made by Bob, seconded by Frank Brown. Thank you. Any discussion? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye or raising your right hand.
Aye.
Opposed? Let the record reflect that the vote was unanimous. And Jody, typically your staff would prepare something for the council. And can you all take care of that and send it to me for review? Thank you. Appreciate it. I see you shaking your head. So thank you.
Yeah, I had to get my mute off. Sure, we will. I apologize for not having a regular staff person here, though the recording will serve. We'll look at the recording and do the minutes at a later time. I've got several, people out for leave, people on vacation, people that can't make it today. So it's just, I couldn't find anybody to do the minutes that would understand.
Okay. No problem. You'll take care of from the recording.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you to the commission members and staff and everybody for that really very thoughtful, comprehensive presentation on the city dock financing. I see that Alderman Schandelmeyer has joined us. Welcome. Nice to have you, your first attendance at one of our meetings.
Yeah, sorry I'm late.
Thank you very much for joining us. If you just give us a couple minutes to get through a couple of other items, then we'll take up your item, okay? Thank you. Mr. City Manager, anything from you?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Jim Cardillo, anything from the audit committee this month?
Yeah, thanks. The audit committee met on the 19th of September, the most recent meeting. We are still discussing the implementation of performance measures. The new city manager, Mr. Malinoff, is recommending using a different source for this, which will be more applicable. And we are also considering the strategic plan.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any questions of Jim on the audit committee report? Hearing none.
Which it appears I will be continuing to give,
All right.
which it appears I will be continuing to provide.
Bob, any brief report on the spending affordability subcommittee?
Yes, just very briefly, Fred, as both you and I know, we've been in discussions over the summer over the need to recognize the importance of perhaps acquiring some additional data, economic data and tax data for the city, which may further support the desire and the need for a spending affordability function. We've been talking about some methodology involved in that. I've brought Ed into the picture a little bit about some of what we're discussing, because Ed and I are working together on this spending affordability effort. And I think that the intent is at some point, Fred, that, you and I will feel comfortable enough to bring our additional thoughts to the Financial Advisory Commission for their input and advice as to next steps as we start moving forward. Perhaps a parallel endeavor that would dovetail very nicely with what we're hoping to do with getting to a point and making a recommendation on a spending affordability function for the city.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Moving on, yes, Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the city is making a lot of progress in several areas. I think the work on the strategic plan, which is going to begin in earnest in January with retreats by both the senior staff and the city council, is going to be a very important milestone to put together the management of the city. I envision the strategic plan overlaying the performance measures for each of the departments, and those in turn helping to form the performance appraisals for each of the employees. On another front, we are moving forward with a comprehensive plan which looks at our land use. Today, we discuss the issuance of some bonds, a significant amount of bonds, and I think that the having a spending affordability model guidance, as the state has, as the county has, is another important addition to the management picture. And I have spent considerable amount of time looking at the spending affordability model used by the state and the county, and looking at it as a person who has some analytical skills in this area. I think that the model that the county and state are using is very, very adaptable to the city. We'll have to pay some money to get some consultation. I think we have actually some good people that put together the spending affordability, but we also got a wonderful report from Mary Burkholder, who's got an economic company that we've used for advice, including advice on the city dock. So I am continuing to feel quite anxious that we close this loop, and I would very much value a recommendation coming from the Financial Advisory Commission as early as possible. I think the pieces are all there. I think that the need is certainly identifiable, both as exhibited by the state and the county using this kind of a resource. And so I really hope we can close this loop pretty quickly.
Thank you for your comments, Alderman. Bob?
Yeah,
Bob,
Fred.
I was just going to suggest, I don't know what you're going to say, that you and Ed collaborate with Alderman Arnett to see if there's anything, to move forward with at this point.
Well, we've certainly I've been in discussions with Ross periodically, and I understand the urgency that Ross places upon this. I think I've also shared with Ross some of my concerns as well. I do think that with Mike Malinoff now as our new city manager, we need to read him in more on what our discussions have been. And Mike, there was a preliminary report that we issued a little over a year ago, maybe almost 18 months ago. I don't know if you had seen that, but we can, send that preliminary report to you. And I think it would be very helpful if at some point in time, Ed and I and Fred, if he's available, and we include Ross as well, sit down with you.
I think Alderwoman Tierney as well.
Tierney, okay, very good.
Yeah, because I think in this, the Finance Committee and the Audit Committee really need to partner.
Okay, very good. To be able to sit down with you, Mike, and be able to get you fully read in on this and what our thought process and discussions have been in the past. Certainly, your support on this would be critical if this were to go forward, given the role that you have in the city. And I think you are familiar with the spending affordability function on the county level as well as on the state level, and what opportunities potentially exist for some collaboration, and putting together something for the city and finding areas where we could work jointly with the county on some of this. But would welcome the opportunity to read you in fully on this and for us to get together and meet. And we can do that offline, in terms of a further discussion as to what would be the appropriate timing and so forth.
Good. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
I appreciate the comment. Thank you. Before we get to Alderman Schandelmeyer, Jim Cardillo has indicated to me that he'd like to step down as the facts representative to the audit committee. He's served diligently for several years in that role and would like to perhaps find other opportunities to work with and for the fact, with all of his extra spare time. That having been said, in my email out last week, I asked commission members to think as to whether any of them would be interested and willing to take over the great work that Jim has done. Are there any, and Jim, can you share with the other commission members what kind of commitment is involved in what you do on the audit committee?
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Similar to this, there's a monthly meeting that occurs 11 times a year. There's an opportunity to do, I would say, if you consider the meeting length to run, well, in general, 60 to 90 minutes, the time outside of that would be twice that. So an additional somewhere between 2 hours to 3 hours of work outside of the meetings. There are 7 members statutorily of the audit committee, 3 council members, 3 citizen members, and I believe there's vacancies there, and 1 designee from the FACT. I've served as the FACT designee for almost 4 years now, but I'm happy to continue if there are no people on the FACT who are interested in participating as well. Yes, it is an additional commitment from the FACT, but I think from what I've seen with the members of the FACT, everyone will identify different areas of expertise to dive into, sitting as the chair, handling the spending affordability subcommittee or other initiatives of the FACT. That there are opportunities there, and this would be along that same line.
Jim, thank you very much. Are there any FACT members who are interested in stepping up at this point to take over Jim's role with the audit committee?
I'm happy to continue until someone steps forward.
Okay, thank you, Jim. There are 2 commission members who are not here today, and I will reach out to them personally and see if either of them are willing to step up. And thank you for your willingness to continue until replaced.
Mr. Chair.
Not very good, but anyway. So all that having been said, brings us to Alderman Schandelmeyer. And yes, Ross.
Thank you. First of all, I think Jim has been typically modest because I think outside of the audit committee. He's been quite a help to the finance director, and particularly with getting the replacement outside auditor. There is a commission member who is also an auditor. I personally would hate to lose Jim because he really is, if at worst, co-chair of the committee. But it would be helpful if there was someone with audit experience, particularly since we lost Katie George, who also was an auditor. And quite frankly, the 3 council members on the audit committee have no audit experience whatsoever. And we really rely heavily on outside expertise and have relied heavily on Jim's expertise. So this is, I understand the time commitment, but it is, I think, a very important function for having someone from the FAC, particularly as it ties to all the other things that the FAC is looking at. So I would just make those comments and hope that we continue to have some auditor on the committee, and there is another opportunity from the FAC, but I'd hate to lose Jim.
Is there anybody else on the FAC who is an auditor or that expertise?
Not present in the room.
Yeah, he's not here, but I'm blanking on his name now, but he was a longtime auditor for the federal government. And in fact, that gives him even.
Commissioner Bannon?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But I worry about him not being here. In fact, I haven't seen him for several FAC meetings, but we would really, I mean, Jim really throws his weight into the FAC, and we would hope to have similar kind of support from another member.
Arnett, do you know Mr. Bannon personally?
I do not.
No,
I know he lives in my ward. In fact, I think
let
he
me
lives
ask you
right
this.
next door to Susie Smith,
Let-
but
let
I
me-
don't know.
Let me ask you this. Would you be willing to reach out to him as
Yes,
chair of the audit committee and say, I would really love to have your expertise? Would you consider doing it?
I will do that, but I will admit I'll do it with mixed emotions because I like the incumbent.
Thank you, Ross. Fred, just let me say that in addition to the FAC representative, there are positions for 3 citizen members. I have previously identified 2 citizen members to serve on the committee, one of which ended up taking herself out of the audit committee by taking a position with the city. And Alderwoman Tierney has identified another citizen member, and I've met with that citizen member. So I'm happy to encourage additional citizen members to serve on the committee, and that would, in a way, kind of scale back my audit committee involvement and stay on the FAC stay on the audit committee as the FAC representative. So there is an opportunity there to remain as the FAC designee if I can identify additional citizen members on the committee. And that's where the gap is right now, with the lack of citizen members.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim. For your
Thank you.
willingness.
All right, I've taken up too much time. I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. Now, Alderman Schandelmeyer, again, welcome. Thank you. Sorry for the delay in getting to this. FAC members, you know that over the years, we talk about sustainability of the city and city finances, and how do we don't want to raise taxes, don't want to cut services, but are one or either both of those necessary for fiscal sustainability? Well, Alderman Schandelmeyer sent me an email, much appreciated on, I believe, June 29th, which I forwarded to all of you, expressing some different views of his relating to long-term fiscal sustainability and its relationship to land use opportunities and challenges here in the city, and the upcoming comprehensive plan. What I'd like to do, since you're kind enough to be with us this morning, ask him to share his views, and is there anything that he's looking for at this point in time from the FAC, or is it more for informational, so that we are kind of educated on the kind of same wavelength and be available as a resource if there are certain things that come up during the course of events over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, that he and the council may want our opinion on or advice on. So with all of that, welcome again, and let me turn the floor over to you, Alderman Schandelmeyer, and thank you.
Hello. First of all, I'm sorry I'm a little bit late. My bus gets caught in the same traffic everybody else does, and throw a little rain on Route 50 and everything goes to heck in a basket. So I don't know if Mr. Sussman forwarded along the video to everybody, kind of explaining what the goal of this study is. But essentially,
Alderman, I believe that was in your email. There was
Okay.
a link to it. Whether anybody looked at it or not is a different question. But go ahead.
well, in that case, it was definitely forwarded over to you. I do hope you watch it because it does a fantastic example with visual aids and data for what this study is trying to do. The city of Annapolis, in the most recent budget, approved an amendment that I put forward where we would be doing an economic value analysis of the land itself. We've currently begun the bidding process. There are about 5 firms that are interested in potentially conducting this. But what the goal is it's to get down all the way to the parcel and parcel of land and revenue per acre for all of the land inside the city of Annapolis, and also analyzing the expenditure per parcel and expenditures per acre. And this is something that the city has never really studied. I believe we have an inaccurate idea of land productivity. And this is going to give us hard data. And while we cannot say this for certain yet, I think we can have a pretty good hypothesis based on literally every other study that has been done around this. What we're going to see is the majority of the city's land is not financially productive. And we can then, using that information, take steps to make it more financially productive, to make us a more resilient and sustainable city. Essentially, what I said to Mr. Sussman is this is going to break down, not necessarily on neighborhoods that we view traditionally as wealthy, neighborhoods that we feel currently as
Excuse me, can you, we're losing your audio. Can you perhaps talk a little bit closer to the mic?
how's that?
Much better, thank you.
All right. Don't know where I lost you guys, but essentially what we're going to see though is this isn't by looking at the economic and land value of neighborhoods. What we are going to see is going to potentially surprise a lot of folks because it's not going to break down on, it's likely not going to break down on what we see as, oh, this neighborhood that's a little lower income is getting subsidized by this wealthier neighborhood. What I think we're going to see based upon other cities that various firms have studied in this case, that we're going to actually see the reverse in certain cases. Something I pointed out to Mr. Sussman along with the revenue per acre chart that I sent to the committee is Clay Street has a higher revenue per acre than Huntington. And I think we're going to see that, and it's going to give a fine example, a good example of the land patterns of why that is the case.
Okay, and what do you envision the outcome of this type of study? What do you derive from that? What type of legislation or otherwise would you expect to come out of it or hope to come out of it? How is it implemented? Things like that.
Yes. So when we get the full breakdown of this, I would be grateful for the committee to take a look at legislation that could help improve the financial productivity of that land. Every little bit helps. We are a legislative body that tends to favor the status quo, and little bits of data and encouragement is always useful.
Are you hoping or prognosticating that if there is legislation to deal with the issue as you framed it, that it would generate additional tax revenues for the city?
Yes, but it would generate additional tax revenue, and it would also spread the burden of expenditures that we do in a more sustainable way. At the current moment, because a lot of our city is developed in a more spread out pattern, and by law, we cannot change that at the moment. We have a lot of city services, city infrastructure that gets forced to be paid for by fewer people, and we force a larger spread out infrastructure type. For example, the majority of the city is zoned R1 and R2, which are both single unit lots. And what that does is it means that you have a wider bit of infrastructure connected and only one unit paying into that. Versus when you have more mixed use types of zoning and land use, denser types of housing, denser types of commercial, you have more units paying into that stretch of infrastructure. When you look at the revenue per acre map, you can actually see that one of the most financially productive areas in the city is downtown and then the Park Place area, where it ends up having lots of mixed use, lots of retail, all within a very small distance. And all of that is paying into the infrastructure costs. So it's areas like downtown, Park Place, Eastport is relatively financially productive on the revenue per acre. I don't know the expenditures, but I'm going to guess it's probably one of the more financially sustainable neighborhoods as well, because it is a lot more condensed than others. West Annapolis, these are the areas that we see on the revenue per acre map that are very productive. When we get the data of financial expenditures, we're going to see that they're very, very productive and that they are subsidizing the rest of the city, which was forced into bad land use patterns by our zoning code. And if we see this, it is my goal that we can have a solid piece of data for why we need to update that.
And this is, as you envision it, a long-term process. We're not going to
Yes.
see any shift overnight, particularly because so much of the city is built out. So it's a matter of how to best use and reuse the land over a sustained period of time. It's going to change the equilibrium.
Yes, this is a longer term process. But if we do not do this, I think that all of these arguments over cut services, raise taxes, they're just going to keep happening year after year. And we're not going to get to a point where we can just be financially sustainable.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Let me open it up to questions or comments from commission members or anybody else. Bob Burden.
Yeah, Fred, I see that Ellie had her hand up before
Oh, did
me.
she? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Okay,
I
so I'll
apologize.
follow her.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you for that indulgence. I just want for clarity, I don't want it to be misunderstood that we don't have knowledge of the value of our public property. I just want to remind the Finance Advisory Commission that we did do an evaluation of all of our public assets in preparation for the public-private partnership situation at City Dock, if you remember that. So we did do an analysis of our public property assets. And so just so you know, we have a handle on that. I think what my colleague is looking at is the viability of future development, whether high density versus more of a sprawl is in the best interest of the city as far as utility servicing, et cetera, et cetera. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brooks.
That is absolutely correct. I apologize for my lack of clarity. I have not had coffee yet. And
That's a
I'm
good-
normally 3 cups deep by now. So
No problem, no problem. Thank you for the clarification, Councilwoman.
but yes, this is
Alderwoman, sorry.
this is going to be a study of the land value of private lots public lots as well, but most of what we're going to be getting out of this is the value of private lots and how to slate with upcoming development patterns, and style, and adjustments and changes, and how we can turn that into a more financially conservative way.
Thank you. Bob, I'm sorry, up
Sure.
to you.
Sure. Brooks, thank you for bringing this to the fact. Appreciate it very much. And actually, I think it's a very welcomed type endeavor and undertaking, particularly as it's associated with the 2040 comprehensive plan. To get a full handle on what the assessable tax base is and the value of the properties within, the city's limits would be important. I do know that, and I've been involved in previous comprehensive plans, not having that knowledge leads to discussions about downzoning, upzoning of properties that do have a financial impact upon the city's ability through the assessable tax base, to be able to meet the core service needs of both our residents and our businesses. There have been instances in the city where we did not have that knowledge and certain decisions were made referencing downzoning within the city. Two properties in particular that I can point to is when the hospital moved out of the city to parole, that property was downzoned, and there was a lot of discussion on that, whether that was the right decision or not. The other property was the old Capital Gazette newspaper property, was downzoned as well, which, again, it's questionable whether that decision was appropriate or not, given the fact that it did impact the assessable tax base of the city. Brooks, back in 1999 and 2000, what was then the city's economic development effort in the Chamber of Commerce for the city did engage in a similar type of undertaking. We did get a report issued out of that, which gave us some insight as to where the potential opportunities were in terms of economic development related to the assessable tax base, and where the potential was for improving the assessable tax base or growing it, looking at all the different areas, communities, business districts, and so forth within the city of Annapolis. And that information actually, I thought, proved very valuable. It's probably sitting on a shelf somewhere gathering dust if you could ever find it. What came out of that, I wish had some political will to be able to implement it in the past comprehensive plan, but it really didn't. And my hope is that this undertaking that you're proposing would meet with a more suitable political environment as we take a look at the 2040 comprehensive plan, and the importance of truly understanding what our assessable tax base is, both residential and commercial, and how that tax base should be viewed and looked at when we start considering, what type of resources exist for implementing a 2040 comprehensive plan and the various needs and desires of our residents and our businesses, that make up our city, which we call Annapolis. I can, talk with you offline to fill you in on what our effort in 1999 and 2000 generated for us in terms of information. I think you'll find it rather fascinating. I don't have a copy of that reported document, but I do have a pretty darn good memory. And I could, pass some of that along as you move forward on your RFP, which I think we received a copy of. And I think that, the questions that it's seeking answers for are going to be, very valuable and very important to the city. And I really appreciate you bringing it to the forefront, Brooks. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. I would love to have that conversation.
Thank you, Bob.
Love land use.
Appreciate your comments and your thoughts. And your memory must be a little bit better than mine because I don't remember that even though I was around at the time. So funny how we all remember different things. So, Brooks, anything else? Any other final comments on your end?
Yeah, so I do highly encourage, if you had not had the opportunity to do so, to watch that video that I sent you. It's 10 minutes and 30 seconds. It gives a great breakdown of what this will do. And again, while we don't have the Annapolis specific data yet, we can make pretty good estimates of what we will find based upon pretty much every other study that has been done. I do encourage you to check out some of the firms that do this sort of process. It's very interesting just to see some of their past studies and work. There are currently 5 on there. Mr. Sussman, I can check with Mr. Lashinsky to see if I'm allowed to share the people that are currently looking at this. I believe I would be, but I just don't want to accidentally spread out non-public info yet. But yeah, definitely check out the firm, some of the stuff that they've done. It's very interesting, and it will get us to a more financially resilient position, or at least give us a blueprint to get there.
Fred, I think you froze.
Oh, thank goodness. I thought that was just me.
No, I think that's Fred. I think Fred is frozen there.
Oh, no.
Maybe he
Yeah,
might.
Bob, I'd love to have that conversation with you. I was in Annapolis in 1999. So
yeah. Certainly, I'll reach out to you by email and we can set up a time to connect, and I can share some of what my recollection is on what we did. Fred, that was done back in 1999 with Susan Zellers, was running economic development. And so that's during the period of time when a lot of that information was gathered. And that was done in conjunction with trying to get a fuller understanding of how the historic district designations of about 80% of the buildings in the core city of Annapolis, presented a challenge in terms of how the assessable tax base was being determined. And it also looked at the amount of property in the core city area that was virtually non-taxable because it, was being occupied by federal, state, county, and nonprofit entities, and how that impacted, the assessable tax base of the city. And it did look at potential upzoning and downzoning issues and stuff like that. It was pretty much undertaken with the the Economic Development Committee of the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Department of the city back in 1999 and 2000. And it was done within that venue.
Thank you, Bob. I see Jim and Ross have their hands up. I don't know who went up first, or Jim's hand is down.
Jim did.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the discussion on better utilization. About 3 years ago, Jody had provided us with some data on the assessed value of city property, and there was roughly 20% of the assessed value, somewhere around 1.8 billion, of property that was exempt from tax. So we are also limited by that. If you say that 1 out of every 5 assessed dollars within the city limits is not available, which kind of rolls us back to the discussion of pilot. And I don't know if the city is then pursuing a renegotiated pilot with the state. So one piece is the pilot. The other piece is that exempt property. Is there anything? Can we get creative on exempt property and come up with some sort of something akin to a pilot for exempt property, not just between us and the state, but any other property that's classified as exempt?
I don't know the answer to the question. That's a lot.
I can actually speak to that.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you. I think there's an opportunity there to expand, not only to modify the use, but to expand our tax base.
So years ago, Joe Budge did twice a marrying of our city parcels to the SStat data. And that's where it was actually 19% of the city property is tax exempt. And the surprising part of that was that it's not just schools and governments. There's a lot of 501c3 lobbying groups that are tax exempt. But I bring that data up, and also some of the data that is in some of the spending affordability models, because they're all of the components that would need to go together to fill out this picture of where the dollars are coming from and where they're spent. Joe Cater, who was on the Financial Advisory Commission, actually had a lot of experience in this area, did it for a lot of other municipalities. He did warn that we might not like all of the findings that we see from this kind of study, but I don't think that absolves us from the need to do it. So I think this is all pretty exciting. And I hope the fact, and particularly with Bob's legendary memory and experience, we can move forward on this.
Thank you, Alderman. Alderman Schneidermeyer, again, thank you very much for coming and for enlightening us. What I would ask from you is if there's a point going forward where you'd like to bring additional information or have some asks from the FAC, please feel free to do so.
Yeah. One of the exciting things is one of the firms that is putting a bid out on this will do is the firm's CEO. Once the data is collected, he will actually be coming into Annapolis. He will be willing to come to Annapolis and do presentations. And I'm sure the other firms would be willing to do that as well. So we can make sure that one of those presentations is done to the Financial Advisory Commission and a whole lot of other cool stuff. I coffee that, but I apologize.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Bob?
Yeah, Brooks, what do you anticipate would be the potential outlay that the city would need to make for this type of undertaking to gather this data and this information? You put out an RFPs, but do you have some type of idea of what the potential outlay the city will have to make to acquire these services to gather this information?
I think that all of that info would be in the RFP. One of the things that I was adding in conversations to Eric Wyszynski, who was the driver of kind of procurement of this, was along with like infrastructure expenses. I would like to try and get information on the biggest spending that the city does, police, fire, public safety expenses, and then out of curiosity, just to see what education expenses are as well. So,
Brooks, how much is budgeted for this?
I think this was about $20,000 or $30,000 budget amendment. It's higher than that, but it was approved in the most recent budget. So
that gives me a ballpark anyway. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything
Well,
else?
certainly the investment would be well worth it in terms of the return that would come off of it with this type of information. And certainly with the information that's gathered here, Ross, as you mentioned, Joe Budge's effort and undertaking could be wedded into that. I do remember you and I talking about it, and you sent a copy of that over to me. And that is very valuable information that Joe put together. So, there's a number of different resources and efforts that were undertaken in the past that we could pass along to Brooks, so that as he, along with the city council, and yourself start pursuing this undertaking, could hopefully, bring together some good quality data that could be helpful, particularly in the comprehensive planning process, but also better understanding our assessable tax base here in the city.
And once again, a former FAC member, Ross Deerdorf, excelled in pulling together this kind of data at the county
did.
level.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of nearby resources that I think, and I'm happy to get started with 20,000. I think we're going to need more to do it right, but getting it started is the important factor. But Ross Deerdorf, actually Babe Feldman is another person in the local area that has some expertise. So there's expertise around, and I'd love to see Ross Deerdorf back in the traces again. He was quite a valuable FAC member for a long time.
Okay, anything else for the good of the order?
Fred, just one quick thing.
Yes, Ed?
In view of the time, we may not be able to take it up today, but I know we had some meetings in the spring and into the summer over the collective bargaining agreements, and then we had submitted correspondence reflecting our views on that. I, for one, don't know what the reaction was, what the outcome was, what if anything was done in response to that, and then the broader question of the future role of the FAC in terms of providing input and assistance on the negotiations. I know that was a topic that had come up. So if we can't deal with that today in view of the time, would it be possible to put that on an upcoming meeting to know where things came out and where we think we might go to improve the process?
Sure. I think it's kind of getting late right now. I know I have some other commitments coming up shortly. But I'll put it on the agenda for the next meeting, and maybe if staff can be prepared to address that at the next meeting, it would be helpful. Did we lose? Oh, no, there you are. You're playing musical blocks on my screen. So you move from lower left to upper right. I lost you. So I'll put that on the agenda for the next meeting, Ed.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else from anybody? Thank you all for your participation. Very good meeting, probably one of the best meetings we've had in quite a while. I think we got a lot done, and thanks to everybody for that. Next meeting is November 10th at 8 a.m. by Zoom. And with that, thanks for everybody attending. Entertain a motion to adjourn. Bob Bird moved to adjourn, seconded by Jim. All in favor of adjourning, signify by saying aye or raising your right hand. Opposed? Everybody have a great day, and thanks for attending.